Yo, dudes. Well, it seems that you don't want any funny stuff towards the end of the year. You're here for the serious learning shit. Quite right too. So, pin back your ears, let's do some serious learning shit. United States of America. Real income. Consumption and savings. Real. Adapted for inflation. Going back to 1961, the blue one is the disposable income and the yellow is consumption, and the savings bumps along the bottom. Basically, you just about spend everything you get. As you can see, from 1961 up till 2007 or 8, there has been a gradual rise in the real income consumption, but not savings. But after 2007, this Great Recession thing is effectively going on still, and we can see that in the disposable income, which hasn't risen above 2006 sort of levels yet. But I'm sure it'll get going again. And savings, you can see, if you think about it, back in 1961, that red line wasn't very high, but it was a bigger percentage of the smaller number when it was in blue. You know, it was a little percentage of $12,000 as opposed to now, where it's a little percentage of a bigger number. So you're actually saving less, if I read that correctly. Right, moving on. Got this from Seeking Alpha site, if I remember me right, and it's one of these where we first scratch our heads and think, well, does debt to GDP ratios really make sense? You know, it's a bit of apples and oranges comparison, but everyone seems well happy with it, so let's go with it. But what we have here is US private debt in pretty blue, and as you can see, it was first big spike was just before the Great Depression, and then it came down during the Second World War, and since the Second World War has really been on a climb ever since. And the pretty pink is US federal debt, again percentage of GDP, and it rose up to help the blue line down after the Great Depression, and has really bumped along at a reasonable rate ever since. But obviously this chart points to next with a question mark out there to the right. What will happen next? I think we can say that it's unlikely that that blue is going to go up much anymore, and probably will come down. Whether it comes down as sharply as the Great Depression time, who knows, but I think we can certainly say that the pretty pink line will go up to help the pretty blue line come down. Yes, US federal debt will have to rise to help the US private debt come down. What this chart is from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Household debt service payments as a percentage of disposable personal income, going back to late 1970s. Now, what we have, total disposable personal income, and how much of that as a percentage goes on household debt service payments, mortgage, credit cards, car payments and things like that. Where this chart started in the late 70s, it was about 11% of disposable personal income went to debt service payments. You can see it went up. I don't know if in the 80s it was because credit cards were becoming more prevalent, or with the troubles in the 80s people had to go into debt to keep their standard of living up. But it went up, and there was more percentage of debt service payments was being taken out of disposable personal income. But it fell back down again below 11 in 94, and then it ramped itself right back up again till this Great Recession sort of crash, where, with manipulation from the Federal Reserve, presumably that's what's happening here, getting interest rates down as low as possible to help the great American public, basically the household debt service payment percentage has come back down to one of its lowest points. Okay, so it's about 11% where it was in the late 70s. Moving over the channel to the Telegraph, and it's Martin no, I haven't finished with you Americans, no running off just because I've gone to Europe. I'll be back. Martin Feldstein. The French just don't get problems at Euro's heart. And from the article we read, Professor Feldstein said French officials apparently don't recognise the importance of the fact that Britain is outside the Eurozone and therefore has its own currency, which means that there is no risk that Britain will default on its debts. Below the gap there, when interest and principal, is there a definite way to spell principal and principal? I changed it in one of my writings over the last few days because I thought, well, that doesn't look right, so I checked it. I thought I changed it from principal to principal. Don't know. Anyway, can't imagine that Feldstein would get it wrong. When interest and principal on British government debt comes due, the British government can always create additional pounds to meet those obligations. I'll repeat that. When interest and principal on British government debt comes due, the British government can always create additional pounds to meet those obligations. By contrast, the French government and the French central bank cannot create euros. If investors are unwilling to finance the French budget deficit, that is, if France cannot borrow to finance that deficit, France will be forced to default. Financial Times, Beyond BRICS section. Saudi Arabia, spend it while you can. While most Western governments are, by now, checking ministry sofas for any loose change that might have been lost in its creases, which is quite a nice start, Saudi Arabia increased spending by 25% this year and has still been able to notch up a budget surplus north of $81 billion, or 14% of the kingdom's annual economic output. Emboldened, the kingdom now plans to raise government spending further next year to an all-time budget high of 690 billion Saudi riyal, according to the 2012 fiscal plan approved on Tuesday. A planned Saudi riyal 250 billion splurge on housing projects comes on top, as the money needed has already been deposited at the central bank. Now, I thought that was quite funny that you know, they're so flush they can just put the money, which would be import money for selling oil, into the central bank and say spend that on all the fluffy stuff that we want to buy, which doesn't include that new 100 billion project on upping their output, we note. And we still wonder quite why. And another thing came to mystic mind. Who taught these Saudi people how to do governmental or country accounting? 1911, King Ibn Saud had taken Riyadh by that time 100 years ago, but he certainly hadn't united the country. I think he took, between the First and Second World War, to unite the country. Nejd and the Hijaz wasn't under his control then. It's a new country, and they will have had to have learnt how to do accounting. Anyway, moving on to Roger and Phyllis Mitchell, who run a site all about sovereign currency and all that sort of stuff. And from one of his articles, the last link, number 7, we have just these 4 paragraphs to discuss if you wish. Because a monetarily sovereign nation has the unlimited power to create its sovereign currency, it never needs to borrow, and it never can be forced into bankruptcy. It can pay any bill of any size at any time. In fact, the federal government creates money by paying its bills. The US has created many trillions of dollars simply by pressing computer keys, and will continue to do so. It does not owe anyone for creating these dollars. The government cannot live beyond its means. It has no means to live beyond. By contrast, if the debts of France, Germany et al. Exceed their ability to obtain euros, they, as monetarily non-sovereign nations, could be forced into bankruptcy. Everything you believe about your personal finances, debts, deficits, spending, affordability, saving and budgeting are inappropriate to US federal finances. For this reason, your personal intuition about US financing is likely wrong. Because no monetarily sovereign nation can be forced into bankruptcy, none of that nation's agencies can be forced into bankruptcy either. The US Supreme Court, the Department of Defense, Congress, Social Security, Medicare, and any of the other 1,300 federal agencies cannot go bankrupt unless the federal government wishes it. Brackets, all the talk about Social Security or Medicare going bankrupt is misguided. Even if FICA were eliminated, Social Security and Medicare would not need to go bankrupt. Close brackets. Mystic says goodbye. See you in the comments. Bye.